You won't get much more of an 80s action film inspired game than Cabal. Just look at the artwork for the game. That typical action hero on the cover of the game reeks in Rambo, with the commando sported in headband and muscles bigger than the rifles themselves. Yes, the 1980s was packed of action films, and developers and publishers wanted a piece of that Stallone and Schwarzenegger action, blowing everything up in their games. Blowing up tanks and picking up little dudes in phone booths was the hit thing to do during this decade of pure awesomeness. TAD Corporation developed Cabal for Taito in Japan, whereas the west of the world knew it as a Capcom release. Regardless, both of these publishers were and still are the big boys of this era of arcade gaming. So if you're unfamiliar with Cabal, what is it, I hear you ask? Well, you control a commando or can play two-player co-op games where we literally annihilate everything in sight and destroy several enemy bases throughout its 5 stages, which comprises of 4 levels in each stage. It's a fairly sizable game, and believe me, this game gets tough towards the end. Believe it or not, but the arcade game itself was considered as just a minor success compared with other arcade games releasing in 1988, but it shined more on the home computer and console conversions, in which Ocean Software largely produced the computer versions, and MB or Milton Bradley produced its console version that it had. The game itself was a fairly innovative one at the time of its release, and was originally played in the arcade with a trackball. As with all of the arcade ports videos in this series, today we are checking out which version of 1988's Cabal was the very best version that you could have had back in the day. As I began playing Ocean's 1980 Amstrad CPC release, I was optimistic. Sure, the colours of the levels are monochrome, but this switches colours between stages, whereas the sprites themselves stand out a hell of a lot here because they have several colours and details. It seems that Ocean put some effort into the sprites for this version. The downfall of the gameplay really begins when I noticed that a few enemies being on screen simultaneously slowed down the gameplay, and this got even worse when many enemies appeared on screen. When I say many enemies, I really mean it. The absurd amount of them got ridiculous come level 2, and the frame rate suffered massively as a result of this. It can be difficult to see enemy bullets coming towards us at times too, where they almost blend into the scenery. We also have a lack of enemy vehicles in the CPC version, but I guess there really was no need when so many soldiers were attempting to take me down. We have no music, but rather the sound of gunfire, which honestly sounds more like a cap gun being shot rather than rifles or machine guns. When we manage to destroy everything in each level, we don't see our commando running off into the distance with that victory sound. Instead, he just moves to the right hand side. You'll also notice that when dying, instead of the player instantly respawning there and then, we actually get a very quick black screen. Really, like I said, I really wanted to like this version, but there was just too much wrong with it to actually say it was enjoyable. I mean, the amount of enemies and the sheer size of them compared to the gameplay areas just took any enjoyment away at all. There actually came a point where it felt like I was playing one of those LCD games from the 80s and 90s, where the frame rates were so poor, I actually thought, what is the point? Some Commodore 64 games had 2 versions, generally one for the European market and one for America. This is the American version by Capcom, which released back in 1990. It's simply a half-baked game, no question about it. Considering Capcom actually released this is shocking. I was playing through this version and playing the first level, the game just cut out. No, it didn't cut out. The screen simply just goes black once that level has been completed. expected. We don't get the commando doing his usual routine of running into the distance, and we don't even get him walking to the right hand side of the screen once the level has been finished. All we get here is simply a black screen to signify the end of each level. Visually, this is a fairly bad looking game for 1990 for a Commodore 64. There was a hell of a lot better for this era, without a doubt. I also found that I would die every now and again, and there was actually no bullets hitting me. What happened was that helicopters would fire down at times with no bullets showing at all. Although if I was directly under the helicopter, then make no doubt about it, they actually hit me. And talking about helicopters, the sound of propellers are constant on some levels, even if they are on the screen. This really was a badly coded release from Capcom. Even our commando here looks strange compared with other versions. Is Cabal on the ZX Spectrum 48K and 128K computers any good? Well, of course it is a big upgrade from the slugfest that the Amstrad CPC had, where it slowed down so much it just seemed unplayable most of the time. So, first thing you'll notice with this Spectrum 128K version is that it certainly runs miles better than the CPC's version, without a doubt. It's also very responsive, and regardless how much is happening on the screen at any one time, it does maintain the same frame rate, which is very acceptable and also very playable too. Of course, the Amstrad's version had nicer looking sprites in comparison to this version, but on the flip side, the ZX Spectrum's version contains several colours which lights up the levels so much nicer. Hit collision detection is also fairly good here, although sometimes when throwing grenades at enemies, it did appear to make no difference, and so the enemies just ignored the blasts and continued walking around shooting down at me. Sure, the sound effects here are very Spectrum-like. Nevertheless, it doesn't sound anything like the Capgun situation which the CPC produced. Just like the CPC version though, the Spectrum version does miss a couple of opportunities which could have made it much better and more reminiscent to the arcades game that it was converting from. For example, when we finish levels, we also get no jingle here, neither does our commando run off into the distance, so very similar to the Amstrad's game in that respect. Something else is that when dying, the game is consistent and doesn't give us a black screen for a second. It's not a bad version at all. Most Spectrum fans likely enjoyed this Ocean release when it came out in 1989. Next up we have the IBM PC conversion. On first glance this release kind of looks much like a C64 game used in its best graphics modes which was available for this game. It's actually not a bad version, although admittedly the gameplay screens look huge and the enemies are kind of dwarfed because of this. Controlling our commando isn't too bad. I was personally using a keyboard for this version and seemed to be responsive enough when moving left and right as well as firing. I would say it's an average DOS game for this time of 1988, but nothing really spectacular to write home about. Out of all of the DOS arcade ports I've ever talked about in this series to date, I would likely say that Cabal was one of the better games. It's also another release of Cabal which features no in-game music, and although fairly rudimentary, the sound effects for this DOS release are average at best. Even more of a bigger upgrade for the 8-bit computer versions of Cabal was the European C64 release. To be honest with you, I was expecting music and sound effects, or at least an option for either one of these during the gameplay, but sadly sound effects only with this European release. But to be honest, at this point I was getting used to playing the game with only sound effects anyways. Okay then, so what makes this the better 8-bit computer version? Well, despite the lack of music and following the same formula as the Amstrad and Spectrum's versions, whereas finishing a level we just strafe to the right hand side. The C64 European version has got much more going for it visually, as you can see in the gameplay footage. A much bigger gameplay area, and we have less enemies to kill in this version too. Now, although we have less enemies, the game actually seems a little more challenging, whereas there's more bullets coming towards you in this version. Our commando character scrolls beautifully and is very nicely detailed in terms of the sprite design here. Of course, the enemies and tanks are a little over pixelated, but it's not a complete deal breaker, as the level designs are much nicer and more refined, as you see here. The sound effects are acceptable. I have heard miles better produced for the Commodore 64 during my time. If Ocean's coders just put a little more into this, such as running off in the distance animation after clearing a level, this would have been ranked much higher than this. In terms of collision detection, when firing at enemies and chucking grenades, everything seemed to have died, and so hit detection seemed pretty flawless here. This is Cabal Hardcore Edition. By Hardcore Edition, I mean good lord. This version for the Nintendo Entertainment System is the only version in this list where I constantly died at an alarming rate. Not every port of this arcade classic had as many continues on offer like this version did, and for good reason. The NES game seriously requires more than a standard few lives. It's insanely punishing. Okay, so as for the game itself, it takes a little while getting used to the crosshair here, and the reason that is because it kind of feels like it's on ice sliding around everywhere, and it tends to be difficult placing it on enemies to shoot at them. In true Nintendo old school fashion, they just had to pop in something bizarre which no other version had, and that is a loud sound when collecting grenades or weapons. As a game itself, it could have been much better than it actually was, and this was purely down to its insane difficulty level, and the crosshair kind of having a mind of its own at times. It's not really the prettiest NES game I've ever seen. Our commando has no face in this version, and the enemies reminded me of little plastic toy soldiers. Although the Atari ST conversion is a fairly slow experience of Cabal in terms of its slow frame rates throughout, it does maintain a steady pace. In other words, if the screen is bombarded with several sprites at any one time, it doesn't appear to slow down anymore. The game is a nice version of it, and it's coloured fairly well, and make no doubt about it, this is definitely a tough version of the game itself. It's got a fairly nice backing track while we are playing the game, which isn't spot on to the arcade game itself, but it's recognisable at least. Sound effects aren't too bad either with this ST Ocean release. I think likely the Commodore Amiga wins the best arcade port of Cabal for many reasons. Now, it emulates the sound of the arcade game really nicely here. The music and sound effects sound really impressive for what it is and what it's outputting from. And that is two elements of what the rest of the home conversions failed to capture, that perfect arcade sound. The whole presentation just looks and feels like an arcade game, and its difficulty level also matches the arcade game itself. Controlling our commando feels really good too, and rolling around to avoid enemy bullets seems easier to handle than most. Throwing grenades and the explosions caused were pretty much the most convincing out of every conversion to in this video, I think. With everything else going for it which other versions failed to capture entirely, the Commodore Amiga version even has the ending of level animation spot on, with almost the exact same tone of arcade sound to go with it. Of course, it looks very similar to the previous Atari ST game in this video, but this plays so much smoother and much faster to play too. Now, visually, granted, it's not the nicest looking Commodore Amiga game ever made, but it does what it sets out to do, and does it fairly well too. And that's it for ranking every version of Cabal today. What do you think of my choices? Which version did you grow up with? Let us know in the comment section, and until next video comes, thanks for watching. I'll be honest and upfront, this is likely the very worst bunch of arcade ports I have ever played in my arcade port series, and likely entire life as a whole. Many have requested Pit Fighter, which released in the arcades by Atari back in 1990. Now, I am convinced that you want to hear me suffer playing some of these, and suffer I did to the point that despair and rage took over at some point during the making of this video. The original arcade release was praised for its time, and being the second ever game to use digitized sprites was a huge selling point for its time too. The effect was created by using actors with a blue screen behind them to capture different actions and then create moving sprites from them. Fairly complex and impressive technology for its time. Some love this early digital look, some hate it. Personally, I think if it is executed nicely, then it looks great. As for the game itself, Pit Fighter that is, well, it kind of went down in history as being a terrible arcade beat 'em up, but it does have a following and it is an important part of gaming history. That experimental era where developers were finding new ways to make games look as realistic as possible. Largely, this type of technology in games were in their few. Probably Street Fighter the movie went down in history as being the most notable game for using this technology, and even more so for being hated for it. Now, for its time, Pit Fighter is without a doubt a fairly violent and realistic looking game, probably to the same degree as Narc, which also used digitized sprites. The aim of Pit Fighter is simply to beat every opponent that comes our way. We can go bare knuckles and even use weapons which is placed on the floor at times, such as wooden boxes, snooker cubes and even knives. The game is based on making money in the underworld, where the people who are watching you have bets on who's going to be victorious in the fight. If you've ever watched the Tom Hardy Bronson film, where Charles Bronson is fighting people in the criminal underworld for money, then this game is very similar to that. The game goes as far as to have the crowd literally pushing you back into the fight if you walk towards them, as they believe you are trying to do a runner. Pit Fighter is a brutal and dark game, like I said. For its arcade release in 1990, then this was a fairly grim and true to life game. So today we are ranking from worst to best, and trust me, there are many worse versions of Pit Fighter, of which home port of the arcades game was the very next best thing to the arcade game itself. This is going to be painful. Well, at least the music for the Amstrad CPC release was pretty good. This extremely terrible conversion was published by Domark in 1991. I mean, it's kind of okay for a tech demo of some kind, but as a game, it's not really a game. A game is supposedly designed for entertainment and fun. The frustrating thing with this game is the immense delay in controlling your fighter, as well as a major delay in attacking. Regardless, even when punching and kicking other fighters, it sometimes works and other times doesn't seem to register at all that a hit collision has actually occurred. The depth and resizing of the sprites aren't too bad, admittedly, when moving your character to the back end of the stage. The sprites get smaller, but even still, the extreme low frame rates are so bad that everything just looks and plays so unnaturally. Almost like Domark treated CPC fans to a soundtrack where at least they had something good to show for their money spent. I mean, really, an advanced arcades game that was made popular for its digitized sprites alone was never going to translate well to an Amstrad computer. Personally, I think this could have worked much better if this version of the game was a complete 2D affair, whilst maintaining the same characters and levels. Sure, it wouldn't have given people the whole arcades look, but at least it could have been playable and fun to play. Although the ZX Spectrum version isn't much better than Amstrad's version, simply put, a game that likely should have never been ported to either of these home computers, the Spectrum's conversion is more of the same. Very likely that the Amstrad port was just a port of this ZX Spectrum version. So why is this slightly higher in this ranking video? Although it is barely playable, it does move slightly faster, which makes it a whole 1% more playable. But still, really, why? Why would you release this game? Doomwork released this in 1991 for the 48K and 128K Spectrum computers. This footage you see here is actually running from a Spectrum 128K. If you attempted to run this on a 48K Spectrum, I am pretty convinced I would likely blow it up. If you own this version back in the day, I sincerely apologise on behalf of the coders behind this monstrosity. Every now and again, the Game Boy would have an arcade game ported to it, even if it was technically unrealistic for the Game Boy to pull off one successfully. So, this is Pit Fighter for the original Game Boy. This port was released by THQ back in 1992. It's a slight upgrade from the previous versions in this video, but not really by much. Of course, for any fighting game, having a system which registers hits matters a lot if you're planning to progress in a certain game. And this is a slight issue here with this Game Boy release. I wouldn't say collision detection was the worst ever, but there are definitely times when punching and kicking enemies just seems to not matter or deplete opponents' energy bars. When I tested a game for depth and those planes which gives us the illusion of depth within the playing field, I pressed down on the D-pad to find an almost never-ending situation. Sprites remain the same size in this version regardless of where we are in the fighting area. Something that really stands out is that if we hit a fighter over or get hit over whilst on the edge of the playable area, the cheering crowd and the angle they are positioned at just looks utterly weird. It's not really much fun and just seems that as Game Boy was a huge deal around the time of this release, then hey, let's make some extra money from the Game Boy audience. The Sega Master System version of Pit Fighter is the version that stands out more than others in this ranking video by a mile. Of course, the sprites are tiny, and the whole look of what it is attempting to port across onto Sega's 8-bit console is lost entirely. We have new music here, and the sound effects are pretty shoddy too. The sounds of punches sounds more like the sound effects used in the Sega Master System shoot-'em-up game. The thing with this Master System release which actually stood out more than the tiny sprites were the actual environments used. Of course, they do look pretty nice and detailed, but the point is, Pit Fighter isn't supposed to look nice and polished as such. It's a doom and gloomy underground fighting world at the end of the day. The first level here reminded me more like a dance hall. Odd, but that's how it looks to me rather than a dark, dingy cellar somewhere. It's playable and it's kind of responsive enough, but it's also very forgettable too and likely doesn't come into people's minds when talking about classic Sega Master System games. The whole Pit Fighter idea is pretty much gone here. No sprite size changes when moving around, no attempt at digital sprites, it's just, well, called Pit Fighter, and that's about it. Doomwork released this version back in 1993, and I vaguely remember seeing this version in Asda at the time of its release and totally ignored it at the time. Very likely one of the worst Atari ST games I have ever played, and I've played some pretty bad ones in my time. Yes, it doesn't look so bad. I mean, the digitized look is certainly there, well, kind of, but as for the gameplay itself, it is just so terrible. There is much worse out there in terms of frame rates as we have seen so far, but for a 16-bit computer, I am sure that a couple of sacrifices could have been made in order to free up some memory to make this game run a little better. I enabled a 2-player mode at one point and things got even slower, to the point that every punch or kick that I made was literally pausing the music whilst the sound effects was coming through. I also walked to the right and left of the screen to find out we don't even have a crowd watching in this version. It's almost like the digitized crowds were too embarrassed to even be a part of this Atari ST release. Hit collision detection is okay when it wants to work. I found many times that hitting my opponents was doing absolutely nothing at all. And of course, to hit other fighters in this game, you had to make sure that you were on the same level plane as them. But even by doing this, very often, hits and kicks would do absolutely nothing at all. I had a brief look at AtariMania.com to find out that this game is actually rated with a 9 out of 10 out of 32 votes. Now, am I reading this correctly? honestly. I am utterly confused as to why this would be rated this highly. This is a slight upgrade from the Atari ST version, although not much if I'm honest with you. The Commodore Amiga's version is a complete embarrassment to the Amiga computer, and I would likely say it was also one of the worst, if not the worst Amiga arcade conversions I've ever played in this series so far. Hit collision detection seldom works here, probably on par with the ST's version to be fair. I mean, it kind of looks the part like the ST version, it's just not executed very nicely at all. Something with this version that the ST didn't have is the crowd on the right and left hand sides of the screen. Going back to controls though, really again just like the Atari ST version, this game just wants to respond when it feels like doing so. Even picking up weapons from the ground to use in fights seemed like a task to do this. It's one of those types of games that you would have bought at a time for around £30 to £40, played it for 5 minutes in complete horror, and then raged at yourself for being conned by the box artwork that totally made you believe that this was going to be just like the arcades game, which it truly wasn't. The IBM PC version of Pit Fighter released in 1991, again by Domark. All I can say is that although it is slightly smoother than the Amiga's version and looks a little nicer, it is still a frustrating game to play. We have more of the same issues here that most versions suffer with, and of course the most crucial part of any fighting game is that of hit collision detection. There are many times where you can literally sit in despair at your screen playing this game and feeling that life really has reached an all-time low. The frustration level is off the chart altogether with this one. We have for the DOS version here a choice between in-game music or just sound effects only. Sound effects were painful to listen to, and so although the music is fairly bad and doesn't really fit the game much, believe it or not, it is an upgrade from the sound effects. I covered Mortal Kombat some time back, and the DOS version was actually one of the better versions of the game, as at this moment in computing history, DOS games were beginning to get better, but I really cannot say this about Pit Fighter. Now, firstly, by no means this is a perfect version of Pit Fighter, but this Domark Commodore 64 1991 release did try with the limited resources of the Commodore 64 itself, and as we all know at this point, porting a game like Pit Fighter to a very dated computer, even at this point, was going to be a challenge for any 8-bit computer, and even 16-bit computers. But regardless of those limitations, the Commodore 64 manages to actually do a mediocre job of it. Let's just say that this version is at least playable. When hitting other fighters, it seems to do a good job of detecting those collisions. It even adds a shake effect to the screen when pulling off particular moves, and it adds to that arcade feel of it. Now, of course, we have several planes to wander around on each fight, whereas walking to the back of the stage makes the enemy sprite smaller, which gives an illusion of distance. The C64 version, however, keeps the sprites at the same size. It's not every arcade port for the C64 where we also have music as well as sound effects both together, but this C64 release game does, and it really doesn't sound that bad at all. The early 90s seen a good few successful arcade beat-em-up games being converted to the C64, such as Spinal Fight and even Street Fighter 2, both of which I've covered in this series, and both were fairly poor. However, I would say that Pit Fighter was actually miles ahead of those in terms of playability and being actually enjoyable to some degree. I had low expectations of the SNES doing Pit Fighter any justice. It's one of those games that I remember seeing on the shelves as a kid and just chose to ignore it, much like the Master System game. It has taken me up until this point to actually play this Super NES version. Is it good? I mean, considering everything else that was put together for other systems so badly, then this THQ 1992 release is a slight upgrade, but it's still a fairly bad game to be honest. This version version is also one of the most difficult versions of the game by the seams of it. I played this through for around 20 minutes, and even the first opponent was just so frustratingly challenging to beat, I just gave up altogether, as either that or just lose my sanity. Every few seconds we also hear the same crowd cheer when you hit the opponent or the opponent hits you. After 5 minutes of listening to this, that same crowd cheer starts to wear at you greatly. I mean, visually it's capturing the arcade vibe fairly well. It's a dirty and dark looking game, which is of course the point of Pit Fighter. It didn't have pit in the name to imply a nice sparkly wonderland. Something it fails to do though is capture that depth of the gameplay area, in which sprites get smaller as you move towards the back of the fighting areas. Sprites remain the same size, regardless where you are, that is. Talking about sprites then, the digitized style isn't done too badly for the SNES. To sum it up, is this actually a good game? No, likely not. Below average for a SNES beat 'em up game. The Atari Lynx release actually took me by surprise of how well it played, and considering how bad the Game Boy version was, then I had no doubt that this version would be actually much better at all. But I was totally wrong on every level with this one. Firstly, not every version that was clearly put onto systems that wasn't powerful enough to make a half-good conversion had the whole depth effect of sprites changing to smaller and larger sprites when maneuvering around the screen. But this version actually did it. And it did it well, with it looking very fluid too. Atari Corporation released this portable release in 1992. It could have been that Atari, who was also behind the arcade game itself, wanted a development team, which was Al Baker and Associates, to make a decent enough port in order to sell their latest portable gaming system, which was of course the Atari Lynx. The music is nicely constructed here, and sound effects are average if I'm honest. I would go as far to say that this is likely one of the better Atari Lynx games that I've actually played. It just runs so smoothly. A limitation here is that although we have an audience surrounding us, they are animated only very slow to move their arms around cheering you on. Not a complete deal breaker, but of course, just to note it more than anything really. Hitting enemies also feels fairly good here. Yes, definitely a win for the portable versions of Pit Fighter. It was actually nice to find a version of Pit Fighter that seemed decent enough to play, and that version belonged to the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis. It is without a doubt the less frustrating version of Pit Fighter to play in terms of shady hit collision detections. In other words, the Mega Drive or Genesis version released by Tengen in 1992 pretty much has it spot on. Every hit that I made actually matters with this version. Sure, the sprites don't change size when we maneuver around the gameplay area, but really I am pretty convinced that Tengen made the right choice by not doing it at all, and that's why we have a fairly good version here. It's kind of putting playability over visuals and realising the limitations of the hardware, which are of course very limited to a game like Pit Fighter to copy it successfully. In my humble opinion, I don't actually think there was an extremely great port of Pit Fighter at all, and there's likely a reason why the game has been forgotten to history too. There were better beat-em-ups that came before it and after it that didn't rely on realism. This type of game is true testament to why graphics should be left as a second thought, and the first concern for developers should be how well the actual game in question plays. Anyways, that's it for ranking today's horrendous home conversions of Pit Fighter. Let me know in the comments section which version you suffered with back in the day. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. If you enjoy running gun style platform games from the 1980s, and more specifically if you enjoy playing as a warrior who comes from the dawn of time to take down an evil dominator of this mythical fantasy land, then Rygar by Tecmo could be for you. If you originally played this back in 1986 when it released in arcades, then I am sure you have a story or two to tell people about this particular game causing rage, and likely being the type of game that would have happily taken your money whilst you sweated navigating through the 27 levels using your yo-yo-like weapon known as the disc armor, part shield and part chain, which is used to take down all types of monsters. It's one of those games where you have no health, one hit and you are dead, and when you do die, which can happen very frequently, you will rage with pure anger, with the sound of Rygar being hit is a frustrating sound without a doubt. But to prevent this happening, Rygar's disc armor can hit out towards enemies in several positions, as well as stunning enemies through the levels by simply jumping on them. We get to collect all types of goodies throughout the levels in this game, which gives the player extra score points and even power-ups, which are only temporary though. Oh, and to make the game even more of a challenge, each level comes with a time limit too. Yes, Rygar is a tough game, and the further in you get with it, the difficulty levels rises to 100%, where you have to think, was this actually intended to be finished by kids in the first place? Definitely one of the harder platforms I've covered in this arcade port series. So you know the score. Today we are ranking from worst to best, the very best version of Rygar you could have owned back in the day, which matched the 1986 Tecmo arcade game itself. As always, no homebrews, just the original releases only. I'll be honest, this 1987 US Gold release of Rygar for Spectrum 48K computers was a fairly boring version to play. Firstly, it's very difficult to see enemies at times due to the colour clash, and secondly, the controls just seem very clumsy and wooden. I think the controls in particular could have been put together a little better than what they actually were. Now of course we do have a background, so to speak, whereas some other version of this video didn't even have that, but it's not really anything spectacular even for a Spectrum 48K release. It has no music but the typical ZX Spectrum sounds, which you either love or hate. In terms of gameplay, yeah, this version just seems extremely boring and not particularly exciting to play either. This release, and certainly by the year of this release, should have been coded for the ZX Spectrum 128K computers. By coding an arcades game, although a fairly basic arcades game for Spectrum 48K computers, is why we got this release. Very bland, uninspiring, and likely one of the worst Spectrum games I've played in terms of arcades conversions. I will say that there have been fairly recent homebrew versions of Rygar which made massive improvements to the game, specifically the Rygar 128K 2020 edition, which is clearly a massive upgrade from this original release. This is the Sega Master System port, which was released in Japan as Argos no Jujinkan, in which Salio Incorporated released in 1988. It is very unlikely that you've heard of this software house, as they only released 2 games, and of course this is just one of them. So anyways, for the Sega Master System version, this version deviates so much from the arcades game in terms of level design that it is a very bizarre game to play. Instead of having level endings in which we see points from the level we have just completed being tallied up, the Japanese game literally plonks you into the next level without even displaying which level we are about to enter. Some of the level design is so bad here that there are particular parts of the game which made me unsure. For example, spikes normally indicate death, but here we have entire platforms made up of spikes, and we can actually walk on them. There is also a fair amount of sprite flicker too, when too much is happening at once, that is, especially during waterfall background parts of the game. It's not the best best Sega Master System game that I've ever played. It's just not really much fun at all. And much like the Spectrum version, it just seems very boring to play. When pressing firing up, the normal animation that we see isn't actually here. Instead, we just literally get an upwards attack. It's a real dull game for sure. The only thing that I could possibly say that is anything good about this release is the music, and even still, the music really isn't that great. Next up, we have the Nintendo Entertainment Systems release by Tecmo, which released in 1990. So again, just like the Sega Master Systems port, this NES conversion isn't strictly a direct port of the source material, as it goes into a completely different direction to the arcade game itself. We have here RPG elements with this release, where we take advice from characters within the game, as well as having an inventory menu. This game totally took me by surprise of how different it was compared to most of the other versions in this video. So sure, it's different, but even as a game in its own right, it's not particularly wonderful and surely doesn't even go down as a classic NES game. We have a couple of enemy sprites used from the arcade game, but it also introduces new enemies to battle as well as new music in parts of the game. There is a fair bit of sprite flicker too, and it just doesn't look much good for a NES game of this time. Although I did prefer this to the Master System's Japanese release, I still rank this game this low down, as we are attempting to establish the most faithful port of Rygar and the best overall conversion next to the 1986 arcade game itself. Now, this was the first ever time I played Rygar for the Commodore 64, and to be honest, after reading some feedback over on Lemon's 64 and seeing how a few people viewed this as a bad port of a classic arcade game, I was truly thinking that this version was going to rank much lower than what it actually did in this list. The truth be told, Rygar by US Gold isn't a bad conversion at all. Sure, it looks blocky, and yes, there were better looking C64 games in 1987 when this released, but considering this is a US Gold release and knowing their notorious releases, then Rygar really isn't a bad effort at all. The music is actually a very good version of the 1986 arcade game too. So there is absolutely no concerns musically speaking. The C64 has this fairly well covered. In terms of controlling Rygar, again, I am really unsure why some have seen this as a bad conversion. Rygar is probably one of the best and smooth experiences I have played in the entirety of this arcade port series in terms of the Commodore 64. I mean, it isn't 100% accurate to the source material. For example, tombs or rocks that we destroyed to collect goodies are in their few here, but we can get over that. I will also note here that when we want to use our weapon to hit things above us, we cannot simply press up in action button like the arcade game. When doing this here, Rygar jumps, which to be fair, isn't a major issue most of the time anyways. Hit collision detection isn't too bad either. Everything else, including the arcade difficulty level, is pretty much here too. Seriously, if you've never played the C64 version of Rygar, give it a whirl and see what I mean. It's actually a good 8-bit computer port, which I think hasn't had enough praise over the years. Well, I was honestly surprised of how enjoyable Rygar for the Amstrad CPC was. Granted, it took me a few minutes in adjusting myself to its slower frame rate, but having said that, I have tested a hell of a lot slower games for the Amstrad, and I think considering this, it appears to have been coded in mode 0 too. I think this is actually a fairly good accomplishment. As you will see from the gameplay, we have a background here too. Sure, it's not as the arcade game had, but we do have something, and it adds that more visual pleasing side to the game itself. Sure, I did praise the Commodore 64's version, but let's be fair, all that had was a bog standard plain background. Of course, this Amstrad 8-bit computer version is fairly nicely detailed too. Is the Amstrad game faultless? Well, no, not at all, but it's very playable and also has some nicely implemented music which sounds like the arcade game. The included sound effects, which works alongside with the music, are nicely done too. When collecting objects within the game, the sound effect sounds awesome, almost like you have been rewarded for collecting something. So then, on with the not so good. Well, although I've played this game for a little while, there is no doubt about it that when Rygar jumps, it often feels like he is floating. The physics or weight of the sprite itself could have been so much better here. It's very likely one of the best CPC arcade ports that I've covered, and like I say, although not absolute perfection, it's most certainly a real playable game with impressive music and sound effects and visuals. US Gold also released this version back in 1987. It's not too often that I cover the Atari Lynx in these arcade ports videos, but every now and then I do find a particular game that was ported to Atari's portable system, and Rygar was one of them that Atari Corporation released back in 1990. For a portable system, the Atari Lynx handled this port extremely well. Firstly, the visuals are a massive step up from most other versions that I've covered at this point in this video. Sure, this looks incredibly pixelated, as this was recorded using a much larger display rather than the original 3.5-inch screen. The emulation here truly does it no justice. But even still, we have a lovely and bright game here, and the background looks fantastic, especially those waterfalls. It runs fairly smoothly too, and everything is very responsive. One flaw is that Rygar's swinging of his weapon doesn't circle from left to right here, but as we have established so far, no version has actually been entirely perfect or 100% for some reason or another. Music and sound effects are fairly good too for a portable system from the late 1980s. One part of the game that I think Atari Corp did particularly well was the end of the levels, where Rygar automatically walks through the end of the level segment. The statues here looked very impressive. The Atari Lynx game is certainly an impressive one, and it is of course the most complete so far in terms of level design. Yes, we do have a cramped gameplay area of course, but it is perfectly playable. And just remember, feel sorry for the Game Boy and Sega Game Gear fans of Rygar, they didn't actually get a port at all. In fact, Rygar for the Atari Lynx was the only portable version of it available at the time. For anybody who knows the Sharp X68000 library of games, then it is quite likely that you already knew that the Microsoft 1994 release for the Sharp X68000 was likely going to hit top spot of Rygar in this video. This Japanese release is also known as Argos no Senshi, and as you can see from the gameplay footage, this literally is as close to the 1986 Tecmo arcade game as it could possibly get. Well, as far as the original conversions went anyways. Many will likely think, was there not an Amiga or even an Atari ST port of the game? There wasn't originally, however Rygar for the Amiga AGA computers actually had a well-deserved homebrew version in 2019, which you seriously need to check out. As for higher-end computers and getting a really good version, then this Sharp X68000 was actually the answer. There isn't really much I could possibly say that would convince you otherwise, but if you wasn't aware, you would actually assume that you was playing the actual arcade game itself here. It truly is that good, as you can see. From the vibrant and contrasty colours used here, from the fluid gameplay and control system that controls Rygar flawlessly, this is most definitely the best of this game. If you were in Japan at the time of this release, you would have been very chuffed with this near perfect port of the game. And that's it for today's Rygar arcade ports video. As always, drop a comment below and let us know if you necessarily agreed with this ranking video today. Was you deeply disappointed with having a version that totally sucked? If you are new to the channel and want to catch up with this arcade port series, I have left a playlist in the comments section so you can binge watch every episode I have done. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. I Atomic Robo-Kid, one of those awesome shoot-em-ups that barely anybody ever talks about. I see social media posts talking about classic shoot-em-ups all the time. All of the obvious games in the genre from R-Type, Darius, Gradius and so on. Very rarely, if not at all, do I ever see or read anything about this absolutely terrific 1988 UPL arcade game. And it baffles me, it's likely one of the best games out there from the late 1980s. So what is Atomic Robo-Kid? It's a bit of a strange and out there name, isn't it? Well, in a nutshell, the game is set in the 21st century, and bear in mind, when this game was released, it was actually the 20th century, and so the 21st century seemed pretty distant at the time. So anyways, an outpost of Earth known as Terra 12 was contaminated by a sudden burst of radiation. This in turn mutated everything on Terra 12. Meanwhile, alien governors followed the radiation trail and thus invaded the planet, killing off all of the remaining life. A combination of radiation and alien invasions pretty much annihilated all sentient life as well as transplanted life on Terra 12. So we play as Robo-Kid, and our mission is to wipe out the alien governor bosses through 6 stages. And some of these bosses are impressively massive in the original game. We get the 8 different weapons to use throughout the game, as well as having the ability to switch between weapons as we are playing. We also get an option to choose which route we take through the game, rather than it being a more linear shoot 'em up. We can also fly Robo-Kid around in all directions, which we often need in order to shoot down enemies that come from behind us. So we have some fairly good ports of this classic, and today we are ranking from worst to best the home conversions of the very awesome 1988 UPL classic Atomic Robo-Kid. Now, surprisingly, the Commodore 64 was the only 8-bit computer to actually have a port of Atomic Robo-Kid. The ZX Spectrum was supposed to have his own version, and even a demo was distributed at the time, but was ultimately cancelled. So, on with the Commodore 64 game itself then. Well, firstly, I actually think this conversion isn't actually too bad. I have proved over and over again, and it is common knowledge that a mere 8-bit computer would always find it difficult getting a perfect arcade game. Memory constraints, limited color palettes, you know the score. But for what it is, Atomic Robo-Kid for the C64 by Activision that released back in 1990 isn't that bad at all. Yes, we are missing background music, but the sound effects aren't too bad, and the gameplay itself carries its own, even though it is missing particular enemy sprites, including the propeller wheels that we see in the arcade game. Not sure if you noticed, but the artwork for the C64 game actually has the propeller next to Robo-Kid, but of course in the game we don't actually get this. So pretty much false advertising, but this was the early 1990s and it happens more often than not. Sprites are of course small in comparison, and they are fairly blocky here too. But bear in mind, it wouldn't have originally looked like this, most certainly if you were using a CRT TV like myself back in the day, or even a Commodore monitor. This game would have looked good, and those huge blocks of pixels wouldn't have been so prevalent back then. But it is what it is, and Robo-Kid surprisingly scrolls fairly nicely, and it's very nice to control too. There are barely any frame drops here, and that's likely that Activision realised the C64's limits and likely decided to tone it down for the game to run smoother. As I travelled through the various levels of Terra 12, I ended up on the first boss. Now, I was expecting it to be a challenge. Most certainly the arcade game leaves the player slightly crammed for room to manoeuvre around, but here the gigantic boss stays static. And all we really have to do is just stay in one place and shoot him until he blows up. Robo-Kid also doesn't have the magnificent explosion animation when he's being hit. Like I say, the C64 version is a great game for what it is, but in the context of this video, I have ranked it this low as it's missing a fair bit of what it's attempting to port over for the original arcade release. I have mixed opinions with the Atari ST's conversion of Atomic Robo-Kid. On one hand, and as to be expected for the Atari ST, the speed this version runs at is fairly slow compared with other versions in this video, but over time I have adjusted to this within every other arcade ports video I've ever done. The real issue is with this release was that there's just far too much happening on screen at times, and sure, it is much like the arcade game itself, and everything looks and certainly sounds great too. But those times when too many sprites are on the screen at once seriously affects any enjoyment from the game. The more crowded the screen gets, the more laggy the game becomes, and it very quickly becomes very difficult to play the game in terms of maneuvering around to avoid bullets. It is a good version, and like I said, most certainly looks the part for sure. I think from a technical standpoint, Activision, who released it in 1990, should have done what the Commodore 64 version had done, and totally toned down the amount of sprites entering the screen at any one given time. I get it that it's going for the full arcade look, but sometimes particular computers and even consoles could not cope with so much, and this particular game is evidenced by this. Everything else though is pretty much there, including a flashy looking visuals for when collecting new weapons, and selecting the different weapons to use is very easy here to use in this version. Just hold down on the fire button for a couple of seconds, which simply switches between different weapons that you have collected. But really, this game got so difficult to play through its poor frame drops that I could not actually make it past the second stage, which was a real shame. I was actually quite surprised with the performance of the Commodore Amiga's 1990 Activision release of Atomic Robo-Kid. Generally, throughout this series, it's normally the case where Amiga versions of particular games play at significant speeds compared to that of the Atari ST's versions. Although this version does of course play slightly faster, it's not actually much faster than I was expecting it to be. It just feels very clunky and choppy most of the time. Now I have tested this on my real Amiga 600, and just like this recorded emulated version you are watching, both perform roughly around the same. It's not a completely unplayable game where it struggles to run correctly if too much is happening at once, which is where the ST's version suffered most, but it could have run much smoother than what it actually did. Clearly, the music and sound effects are a major upgrade for this Amiga conversion compared to the ST's version, but generally and graphically it's pretty much the same looking game here. The same buttons are used here to switch between weapons, which is of course holding down on the fire button for a couple of seconds. A real shame that Amiga had an almost sluggish version of Atomic Robo-Kid. Hit collision detection, just like the other versions covered so far in this video, was pretty much spot on and absolutely no issues there. I'd say if you had this originally on its release, it's likely a perfectly fine game really, but in comparison videos where we are comparing the same game across multiple platforms, things like this need to be mentioned even if it does sound slightly nitpicking. This PC Engine 1990 Japanese exclusive version by UPL was actually titled Atomic Robo-Kid Special. Although this is a fairly decent version of the game, the levels are very strange as opposed to every other version here in this video. For example, every version of the game has generally followed the same starting level as the arcade game itself, but with this PC Engine version, the first level is actually something different here, which, like I say, seems very bizarre. It continues like this throughout the game, and just as I was getting used to the same pattern of levels in the game, this version changed it entirely. Another little strange feature with this version is having iconic little sprites appear from time to time from entirely different arcade games, such as Ninja Kid, who is of course a fairly big arcade icon from the 1980s. By catching these little icons or little sprites, we actually benefit from achieving an extra life. We also have a health bar included here too, which seems to give the player several chances before we are entirely blown up to lose a life altogether. One thing which I thought was a little bit of a downgrade was that flashy neon animation which zooms in when collecting new weapons. We have no options menu to change difficulty levels of the game, and the default level of difficulty is average. It scrolls nicely enough and doesn't appear to choke its guts out as we play against many enemies on screen at once. I also found the first boss had fairly bad sprite flicker. It's not overly a bad version, and the original arcade levels are here. They just appear to be jumbled around from everything else in this video. Like I said, it's definitely not the worst version of the game by any means though. It looks nice and colourful and also has a fairly good conversion of the arcade music and sound effects. This is the Sega Genesis version of the game, which released by Treco in 1990 for Japan and North America in 1991. There was no European release, and all I'll say is that Europeans had a little less stress without this game being released. Damn, this is a tough version of Atomic Robo-Kid. We have an options menu, as most Genesis games have. We have an option to increase or decrease the difficulty levels from easy to hard. Now, I tried the normal option and found it ridiculously impossible, so I changed it to easy, and it is still what I would call hard. So if you love a game of Atomic Robo-Kid with the toughest challenge possible, then this Sega Genesis version is likely it. It even surpasses the difficulty level of the arcade game itself. As for the game itself then, it's fine. I mean, at this point, it is the smoothest scrolling game and brightest version of it too. It is presented in a slightly zoomed out look where we get to see more of the gameplay areas. The music and sound effects are sounding much more like the arcade game itself here, and it sounds just awesome. There is one thing that I have discovered over the years, is that Mega Drive or Sega Genesis don't shy away from giving us an awesome shoot 'em up despite the difficulty levels. There are parts missing from the arcade original, of course. Normally after completing certain levels we get an animation of Robo-Kid flying into the sky. Well, this isn't actually included with this version at all, but on the plus side, the first main boss is pretty impressively done here, and it certainly is the biggest version of the boss at this point in the video too. Like I say, this is an incredible version, make no doubt about it. To make it even better is that we can change between weapons using a dedicated button on the Genesis controller, rather than having to hold down on fire button for a couple of seconds. It also features no time limit to get through missions, but to be fair, at this point in this video, every version so far has also taken this away for some reason. And in first place, I've ranked the Sharp X68000 conversion. Now, this Sharp X68000 release is pretty much on par with the original arcade game itself. UPL released this back in 1990, and in some ways it's more of a remaster, so to speak, or so it seems. Firstly then, the big noticeable difference here is the music and sound effects in this version. It sounds like the music has had a new layer of it, and it sounds fresh and a little more upbeat, although the same music is used as the arcade release itself. We pretty much get the full game here, including cutscenes and starting the game in the exact same way as the arcade game itself. What's really good about this X68000 port is that we get an options menu here too. Apart from this version, the only one to have this was the Sega Genesis version, but here we actually get an easier version of the game itself. If we choose easy, that is, it's not insanely difficult. I'd even go as far to say that the visuals have had also a slight overhaul too. It looks much more visually striking here, especially when collecting new weapons. That neon target which zooms in looks pretty incredible, especially on an OLED screen play in this version. It also appears to be less pixelated too, and edges around sprites and objects are much more smoothed out as opposed to the arcade game itself. And that's it for ranking every version of Atomic Robo-Kid today. Like I said at the start of the video, definitely definitely an underrated game, and I don't necessarily think there was really a bad version of this game. Some of course ran slower than others, but in general I think I've seen a lot worse in terms of arcade conversions on particular platforms. Anyways, did you play this game in the arcade? Which version did you have? Was you lucky enough to have the awesome Japanese Sharp X68000 back in the day? Anyways, as always, let us know in the comments, and which version do you think should have won? Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. Whenever we think about the arcade games of Sega in which they weren't short of producing quality hits during the 1980s, we automatically think greats such as Outrun, Afterburner, Golden Axe, or even Space Harrier. The list is truly endless, and most of these I have covered in this series. One game that isn't thought of in the same way is Crackdown. This fairly ambitious and extremely cleverly produced 1989 arcade release is in some ways ignored, or at least not spoken about very much these days. If you have never played Crackdown or even seen gameplay of it before, the gameplay screen will likely look a little confusing to you because there really is so much going on all at once. And I will say here that this game has nothing to do with the Xbox 360 2007 game. We control either Ben or Andy as a single player game, or control both at once as a two-player game. The aim of Crackdown then is to ultimately take down the mad scientist, aka Mr. X. We can do this by planting bombs throughout the top-down perspective looking levels. We have a map of each level at the top of the center of the screen, which points our current position as well as marks where the bombs need to be planted, which are marked off with red crosses. Once we have planted them, we can proceed to the exit points of the level. The map also indicates where enemies are located as well as collectibles too. We walk through the level shooting down cyborgs whose AI for 1989 is fairly impressive. We can throw grenades and other destructibles to kill everything on screen, and we can also lean against walls in order to avoid being shot, which is instant death. To the right hand of the screen you will see a blank screen, which is where player 2 can simultaneously play the game. This is going to make a fairly interesting video today due to the complexities of the original arcade game with so much happening. So today we are ranking from worst to best, the very best home conversion of Sega's very awesome 1989 arcade game, Crackdown. At first glance and for the first level, the ZX Spectrum 128K conversion by US Gold seems great and plays fairly well too. As the game progresses, things rapidly go downhill very quickly, and it's a real shame. Firstly, the presentation isn't bad at all. The screen is organised like the arcade game itself, and with the Spectrum's limited abilities, it actually does a really good job here. Things do go downhill though, as I said, and as I played through this version, it got worse, notably at times when shooting at enemies. I noticed that bullets aren't actually coming out of my weapon at all, and that's not a lack of ammo either. One of the most annoying bugs with this release though is that enemies can at times shoot through walls at you and kill you. I found myself losing many lives because of this, and of course because Crackdown has walls everywhere in which we often use for cover, having enemy bullets kill us like this can get very annoying very quickly. I also found that as I was getting through each level, although the game originally started in play fine, it did eventually start to lose its speed and did begin to lag a little later into the game. Now, most frustratingly above all is of course we are on a timer in each level, and having a map to display where the bombs need to be planted is a bonus. It aids us and saves us time to make it out of each level in in time. The problem is that the map doesn't clearly show where we need to plant bombs, and so most of the time I found myself endlessly walking around trying to find the crosses. Meanwhile, the time is ticking away. I found the game a little shoddy, and with a little more cooking and tidying up, then this 1990 ZX Spectrum conversion could have been perfect. It even gives us an animation when planting bombs. Sadly, it just has far too many bugs and annoyances to rate this version any higher. This Amstrad CPC release is a mega upgrade from the previous ZX Spectrum version, although this version, again by US Gold, releasing in 1990, is actually far from perfect, which is a little annoying considering this version looks really good, and we can most certainly make out where bombs need to be placed with this nicer coloured map. The real annoyance with this version is collision detection, and it's fairly bad here too. I had many times here where I would shoot at cyborgs and it would not destroy them, and like I said, this happens far too often, along with enemies also walking through me without actually killing me, and vice versa. In terms of the speeds this game is running at, I actually had no issues with it here. It all ran fairly well for an Amstrad CPC game in comparison to the ZX Spectrum version. We have no music here whilst the game itself is playing, and the sound effects are okay as we are playing through the game. Everything is pretty much here as to what to expect from a good 8-bit home computer version of Crackdown, and it is nicely coloured like I said, and has some fairly nicely detailed graphics too. The most crucial part of any shooting game is of course to stay alive and taking down enemies before they actually shoot you. It's just too broken to achieve this with this Amstrad release. There were times where I was even leaning against walls in order to avoid oncoming bullets being fired at me, and yet the bullets still managed to kill me even though I was leaning against walls at times. We have nicely designed bomb planting animation scenes here, and to be fair, it's fairly okay to control Ben or Andy too in this game. Issues which the Spectrum port had, such as bullets coming through walls, didn't actually appear here, and since we could actually see the map clearly, it did kind of make the game easier to navigate despite the major issues with its collision detections. Now, I found it difficult where to rank this IBM PC DOS conversion of Crackdown. It's a beautifully designed game both visually and most definitely in terms of its music production too. We have everything here with this 1990 Sega of America release. We have an introduction video to the game itself before we start playing, which looks really nice for a DOS game of this era. The noticeable difference with what you have seen so far is of course the graphics. And yes, these are undoubtedly light years ahead of both Amstrad and Spectrum versions, and even the next version in this list. But really, that is where I need to stop praising this DOS game. A good example of gameplay before graphics can actually be seen here. Although the game seems to not really suffer from annoying bugs like the plagued CPC game, where this game truly suffers with its major letdown is in terms of its frame rates. It's extremely bad right from the get-go. Now, you could argue that the CPU speeds are wrong here, but by boosting CPU speeds, the game plays way too fast. And judging from other gameplay videos of this game, then this speed seems more or less how it played originally. It's such a shame because this DOS version was fairly accurate at how the arcade game played. Everything is here from punching and kicking enemies, the sprites that more or less looked the part too. Even the map was a good one here in order to find bomb placements. And like I said, the music production here is pretty damn good too. Sadly, due to those awful, really bad frame rates, the game almost feels unplayable at times, and found myself dying many more times than I should have been due to all of this. Many Commodore 64 arcade ports had both an American release as well as a European release. Normally, one of these releases is much better than the other one. Crackdown, however, received just one release of this game, and as you can see from the gameplay footage, this is a major upgrade from the other two 8-bit computer versions for many reasons. Firstly, we have some seriously awesome SID music for the game here by Mark Cooksey. Hit collision detection isn't absolutely perfection here by any means, but it is a hell of a lot better than, say, the Amstrad CPC's release. When shooting at cyborg enemies, I would say around 95% of the time they would actually be destroyed here. Sprite animation is looking much more substantial too. The movement of Ben or Andy is nice here too, and controlling feels much nicer too. Now, I do actually, however, have a couple of snags with this release, again by US Gold. Problem is that this game is actually tougher than it needs to be, and that's down to the screen and how it scrolls through the game. Instead of it naturally and freely scrolling as we move through each map, with this Commodore 64 version, we move to the sides of each gameplay area for the next part to slowly scroll across to reveal the next part of the map. And this can be very annoying as enemies are dotted around everywhere, and as it slowly scrolls we cannot see what is in front of us, and very often this can cause a loss of life very easily. We can make out where we need to plant our bombs, but I think in that respect the Amstrad CPC's version of the map is actually illustrated much nicer and clearer. As a game itself then, this C64 release looked miles apart from the Spectrum and Amstrad's versions, with much larger looking sprites in. Although the annoyance with the scroll and the gameplay fields were something to consider, I think it's actually swings and roundabouts. But at least here we don't have a major issue with collision detection or bullets which can kill us coming through walls. There appears to be no issue with leaning against walls with this version either. Like I said, not absolute perfection by any means, and that was largely down to the scrolling here. You could say that this was the less frustrating 8-bit computer version of Crackdown. The Atari ST had a release of Crackdown 2. I'll not comment too much here as the next version is almost identical to this version, although the next version in this video played at a better speed as well as had better music and sound effects. I wonder if you can guess which platform the next version was for. In many ways, the Commodore Amiga release reminded me of the C64 version, only, of course, a much more polished game graphically and the music sound much more like the arcade game itself. Of course, with this release, we also have the beauty of music and sound effects during gameplay, and we don't have to have one without the other, which is the normal scenario for many 16-bit computer games. The reason I say that it reminds me of the C64 release is, as good as a version this is, it's mainly let down by the scrolling and waiting for the screen to reveal more of the map that we are playing through. Of course, we do have a nice, bright and more detailed map of the levels, which isn't so frustrating for the eye to view to guide us where we're actually going. I would say that color-wise and sprite design is probably the nicest looking out of all versions in this video. Andy controls really nicely here too, and hit collision detection seems pretty much perfect here, as well as when I lean against walls for cover. I really have no idea if this is generally a hard version of the game itself, or if the scrolling situation makes it just too difficult to play. At this point, I think if coders behind different versions of this game, particularly the versions which like this are made of slow scrolling, if they actually zoom the gameplay out to show more of the gameplay area, then I don't think the slow scroll would be much of an issue, or at least so annoying. It is almost like the sprites are just far too big for the gameplay areas themselves here. It was finally nice to find a version of Crackdown in which I actually enjoyed playing, and the reason that it was so nice to play was simply down to the Mega Drive and Genesis version having a much more zoomed out perspective, and the sprites were just about right where they didn't seem too big to constantly get shot at. The scrolling of the levels was also perfect with this version, and it didn't tend to take forever scrolling to reveal more of the map whilst we are blindly getting shot at. This Sega 16-bit release truly is the best version of Crackdown that you will likely get out of all the other versions in this video. We have introductory animation before the game starts, even animated cutscenes between levels at times. Once we finish levels, then just like the arcade game, our bomber timer counts down and the screen flashes. It even has the tone of the electronic countdown too here. Sure, the map is pretty basic and it did remind me of an Atari 2600 game, but its simplicity through its basic design was likely the best map of all versions in this video. It actually seems like a great help and wasn't too overwhelming to look at either. All versions of this game, apart from this one, offered no options menu to at least change difficulty levels, but we actually had this here, as well as having the option to increase ammunition or decrease ammunition. I think looking back at all the versions of Crackdown, it was a real shame that several had so many issues, which made the game so tough when it didn't need to be. It took until this 1991 release to actually give kids and adults a great home conversion of the arcade classic, and oddly enough, it wasn't put out by US Gold either. Sega Enterprises actually did, and that's likely why this version is what I think is arguably the very best version of Crackdown. They even included voice samples here, and explosions looking sounds really awesome too. And that's it for ranking every version of Sega's very awesome Crackdown today. Which version did you have? Did you have a really awful version of this game? And judging by every version of this game, there was many fairly bad ones. So anyways, as always, leave a comment in the comment section. And if you're new to this series, I'll drop a link to my playlist so you can catch up with every arcade port that I've covered so far. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. Love it or hate it, Double Dragon 3 The Rosetta Stone was at the time in 1990 the third and final game in the famous arcade beat-em-up series that once defines the genre in a spectacular way. I must admit, when I think of Double Dragon 3, memories of playing the Nintendo Entertainment System version, which is of course completely different, was frustrating enough with its bizarre and new style of play as well as having just one life. We then take a look at the arcade game itself, which is again very different to the first two games. The major difference here is the graphical style, of course. It's not quite digitized sprites, but kind of seems like the developers were attempting to add that realistic look to the game, which in reality looks a little strange. As sprites move, they do look very wooden, admittedly. We have the basic combat moves here, including flying kicks, punches, and running, and it is very different to control and play compared to the other two arcade games at this point in the series. This version also featured an option to play as different characters as opposed to just Billy or Jimmy. Technos developed the first two games, and this game was actually contracted to another development team entirely, which was handed to East Technology, who had developed a few games prior to this. They actually developed several games for Taito, and as for Technos, this was the only game that East Technology developed for them. Could it be that this new development team made fans of the Double Dragon franchise divided in opinions, so much so that trusting them with developing another game was totally forbidden? Who knows? I am sure that somebody out there has a story to tell about potential internal issues. But what we do know is that people weren't impressed with its original microtransactions, where we could put more coins in order to buy weapons and upgrades inside the shops throughout this game. A very early attempt then at what the world later on in life would be dominated with, although in 1990 this was complete shock horror at most. Regardless, just like any popular franchise of the 80s, sequels came in their hordes, and Double Dragon would be no exception. So, today we are going to painfully rank from worst to best, the best possible home port of 1990s arcade game Double Dragon 3 The Rosetta Stone. Now, brace yourselves, this is going to be some painful viewing. very possible Double Dragon 3 for the Amstrad CPC, releasing way back in 1991 by the sales curve, is highly likely one of the slowest, if not the slowest, beat-em-ups around. I have covered some horrendous Amstrad arcade ports in this series, but I am pretty confident that at this point in the series, then this is actually the very worst out of all of them. There are so many things wrong with the Amstrad game, it's going to take me a few hours getting through it all, so brace yourselves. Okay, so firstly, as you can see, this game runs incredibly slow, like really slow. At times we see an arrow sign on the right hand side center which says go. Even if we do choose to go, it stays there and doesn't seem to register that we are in fact moving to where it's telling us to go. It's almost like it is so slow that even the Amstrad computer is laughing at it all. Secondly, playing a fighting game with sprites of all the same colour is very confusing, especially when you are crowded around with baddies hitting and kicking you. It's very easy to wonder which one you are, and by having such a slow pace of movement, this makes it even more confusing to know who you are at times. It goes without saying we don't have music here either, just rudimentary sound effects. I get to the end of the first part of stage 1 when all of a sudden enemy sprites are jumping down from above. In the arcades game they actually emerge from the door, but here it's almost like even the enemy sprites had had enough of this game and simply wanted to end it all by jumping off from the top of the building. One of the most irritating things above all is how quickly the timer quickly ticks down as it watches down at you and laughs at you how slow the pace of the game is going at. It truly is a dull and pitiful game that should never have been unleashed on poor innocent kids back then. I honestly feel gutted for anybody who ended up with this version. The only feature I can say that has going for it is when entering shops. It does manage to perform at a good speed at this point. Dear God, I actually thought that the Commodore 64 version would be better than the other versions so far. I was very wrong though. Sure, it looks better, well, the backgrounds at least. The sprites here are just a pixelated mess, which don't even look like good pixelated mess either. The game actually starts off promising, with a fairly good SID tune playing for the game's introduction, as well as giving the player the storyline too, which is even animated. The game then began and my hopes were suddenly squashed. There appears to be no effort whatsoever of even making the sprites in this version walk or move like the arcade game. Here they just move like an average beat 'em up game. Nothing really makes this version stand out like the arcade game did. We have no in-game music, which I was a little bit baffled with. Truth be told, the sound effects here used are pretty god-awful for a 1991 release for the C64 by the sales curve. Now, the real baffling thing is that the sales curve actually produced some really awesome top-quality games before 1991 and during 1991, such as Rodland in 1991, Silkworm in 1989, and Saint Dragon in 1990. I just don't understand how this game could be so bad. As I was saying, the sprites move around fairly quickly, but with this also comes a weightless look about them, especially performing flying kicks. The good thing, I suppose, of this version is how at least it is a hell of a lot quicker to get to end of stages before the timer runs out. Hit collision detection isn't too bad at times, but it just doesn't feel like you're punching and kicking enemies. It just feels flat and almost lifeless. Oddly enough, I went into the shop to test how that looked in the C64 version, and was greeted with a young lady who looked very different to the lady in the arcade game. There have been a lot worse in all fairness to this game. Check out the original 2 Commodore 64 releases for the original Double Dragon game, which I've also covered in this series. Those 2 versions of Double Dragon makes this game look like the best thing since sliced bread. There is parts of the game which is missing, things such as the conveyor belt as we are fighting the first boss, and also the car which we normally see during the main part of stage 1 is actually missing here. possibly one of the only games around where enemies will constantly choose to jump around so much. This is Acclaim's 1992 release for the Nintendo Game Boy. Baffling, and it's obvious to say that the other games of Double Dragon for this platform are just fine. Then we have this version, actually taking away the Rosetta Stone in its title, replacing it with Double Dragon 3, the arcade game. Most noticeably with this version is the music. It's very different from how it should be if it's claiming to be the arcade game, that is. And I must say that this choice of music is very irritating to listen to after just a few minutes of playing. It's a fairly tough game too, and what makes it even more tough is having enemies who constantly jump around everywhere. It's also kind of difficult to see where you are in this version at times. Some monochrome games can get away with doing this, but not this game. Is it a good game then for the Game Boy? Well, not particularly. I'll personally stick with the original Double Dragon games for this platform. This Game Boy game isn't really the best version to pull off special moves either compared to other platforms versions of it. Now, you might call me insane, but yeah, yes I did just put the ZX Spectrum 128KB version over C64 and Game Boy versions, and rightly so too. Now, let me explain. Sure, the C64 game had colours, but with that came sprites that moved around so very quickly and just seemed a fairly bit boring to play. So, the ZX Spectrum isn't attempting to give us that strange movement or rather that realistic look either here, but at least it is slowed down and at a pace where it's kind of enjoyable to play to an extent. Controlling Billy is flawless here, and pulling off attacks just seem less fussy than the previous versions. I will say though that although I felt this was better, it was a tad on the easy side in comparison to the other 8-bit versions. I mean, generally we need to hit an enemy a few times before they fall down. But here, one hit and they are down. If you can ignore the fact that this is a monochrome game, this is a very good play, and kind of reminded me of the pace of something like Target Renegade. We have no music here either, and some sound effects which are okay but nothing particularly special. One thing that I did enjoy most of all with this version is that the easiness of hitting down incoming motorbikes. The other version so far was just pure hell with flying kicking them off to stop them, but here my moves worked first time and they were kissing the floor before you knew it. Hit collision detection is very impressive here too. There wasn't a particular time that I noticed where a hit didn't actually register an enemy. The shops also seem to function very well. Really, I honestly thought this version would be not much better than the Amstrad's poor attempts at this game, but I was very wrong. Although it's not the best ZX Spectrum game of all time, in the context of this video it actually isn't too bad, all things considered. Again, this one released in 1991. Although this IBM PC release looks the part, I will tell you now, this version is incredibly challenging to play. It is going for that wooden look like the arcade game had in terms of movement, that look of realism that is, but it isn't particularly great to control. The strange thing is with this DOS game is that, just like any other DOS game from this era, we have an option to choose our sound card before the game begins. I chose the best option using DOSBox, and sure enough the intro music sounds spectacular. Problem is that the game doesn't feature any in-game music itself, which is a major wasted opportunity for this release by Storm back in '92. The next couple of versions in this video are visually similar to this, but plays a hell of a lot better than this version. Surprisingly, the Atari ST had a very good conversion of Double Dragon 3. Although this is a very speedy version, as you'll witness from the gameplay in the video, I don't think I've ever seen Billy move around so fast, in any other Double Dragon game that is. Now, the Atari ST pushes the slower versions away what we've seen so far, and takes on that Commodore 64 approach by the seams of things. My initial thoughts were, nah, this emulator is set up wrong, but no, this is the speed this version originally ran at, and that shocked me, for normally I complain of Atari ST games suffering from very slow frame rates. So as you can see, of course this version is going to look nicer than the 8-bit conversions undoubtedly, but really it's down to the gameplay, and I kind of proved that with the ZX Spectrum version. Although that version was only monochrome, then damn, it played better than a C64 game in my opinion. It takes a little getting used to compared to the slower versions, but it really isn't a bad Atari ST beat 'em up at all. I will say that it is on the slightly tougher side of versions, but it controls well enough, and those baddies in this version seriously mean business. Hit collisions are detected really well here. No music, which is a shame because I particularly love the arcade's opening level tune, but we might get there eventually in this video. The only major issue I have with this version is its speed of sprites. Now, you could argue that we get through levels quicker this way, but sometimes we need a little precision to attack. Having enemies moving around so quickly is no easy task here. Again, it's just another version where there hasn't really been an attempt to give the game that realism in how characters move around on screen. Its duller colours actually works fairly well, as the arcade game itself wasn't particularly bright and colourful. This was another Sales Code release, in which it also released in '91. I'd happily say that this was one of the better games for this platform. Now, I would likely say that the Commodore Amiga's version was a little better than the Atari ST's offering. Sure, both pretty much look identical, but the speeds which we had in the ST's version wasn't a factor with this version. And in terms of speed, I mean, this Amiga version gave us a much more playable speed in that it's just perfect. Not too slow and not too fast, and it plays a little better for it too for that reason. Where I was failing of lining up enemies to get some precise kicks with the ST's version, where sprites were moving around so quickly, but here this version gave us a little bit more time in order to kick somebody's head in. Sadly, again, just like every other version so far, apart from the Game Boy's release, the Amiga version had no music whatsoever, but I can say that at this point the sound effects here are the very best. The sounds of punches really sounds like we are punching. It's got that bassy sound to it. Really though, graphically and visually, this is almost identical to the ST and the DOS game, if not a slight bit brighter. Again, just like the lack of music each version has failed with so far, this version is also going for the I don't give a toss how the arcade game moved, and it kind of works and plays better than the original arcade game in that respect too. Hit collisions are pretty much spot on here, and yeah, like I've said, it's got that higher ranking to the ST's game for the simple fact that this had better and more manageable speed to sprites, as well as sound effects, which truly packs a punch here. Although this isn't the best Sega Mega Drive beat-em-up games of all time, I'd say that for every version of Double Dragon 3 that was ever released, this is probably the best version to play. Apart from the Game Boy release, it is also the only version to feature music whilst we're playing the game too, which sounds pretty incredible for this Mega Drive release. We also get sound effects here which certainly sound good too. It's much more of a substantial game than the Amiga version, where our sprites look bigger and just seem much more sturdy too. We also get separate facial sprite designs when punching enemies, and it looks pretty good. Of course, this is a fairly tough game like several others in this video, but in good old Sega Mega Drive fashion, we do have an options menu to increase the number of coins we can use within the game. But in terms of difficulty, we actually have no difficulty settings within the Mega Drive release, just a standard difficulty level. Flying Edge released this port in 1993. It was also developed by Software Creations, which is why we have a completely different look compared to most other versions in this video. The Sega Mega Drive version is also one of the only versions which we can run and dive into our enemies. This has always been achieved by quickly tapping left or right followed by an action button. I tried this on most other versions in this video and it never worked. Playing as other characters characters in this version was also good too. It kind of felt like each one of the other characters, when not playing as Billy, offered something a little different in terms of special moves. I actually took advantage of playing as other characters in this release, as other versions did offer this but didn't really do much, and to be fair, I prefer playing Double Dragon as it was intended with either Billy or Jimmy. So that's it for ranking every release of Double Dragon 3 today, and just remember, somebody will likely say it, I didn't include the NES version because the NES version was a different game altogether. So as always, which version was you very disappointed with, and do you necessarily agree with my picks in this list? Drop a comment below, and until next video comes, thanks for watching. An evil alien empire is planning on invading Earth. We must take down this evil empire known as Boson. It's up to either Lieutenant Henry or Sergeant Sanders to get up in the mobile suit, a giant space mecha, and take down this alien scum either alone or as a two-player co-op. This is Hyperdyne Sidearms, more commonly known as simply just Sidearms, a superb Capcom side-scrolling shoot-'em-up which released originally back in 1986. One of those awesome games that Capcom did little with after its initial release. Unlike other franchises that Capcom built upon over the years, Sidearms remains a relic of arcade's past. In some ways, I can see Forgotten Worlds in this game, as it kind of plays similar, and oddly enough, Capcom released Forgotten Worlds a couple years after this game released. In this game then, we pilot a giant space mecha and we can actually shoot at what is in front of us, or by pressing the other action button, this then turns the player around in which we can shoot what's behind us. We can even change between weapons using a third button, and we also get the option to collect power-ups as we play through the game and shoot down aliens. And trust me, you will need some serious firepower at some point in this game. The screen can suddenly get hectic with incoming projectiles coming from all different directions. Interestingly, after defeating bosses, which subcourse at the end of stages, rather than watch our mechas continuing scrolling to the right or even fading out to prepare for the next stage, Sidearms actually does it slightly different of this type of game by starting new missions by actually going downwards into caves. It makes playing a shoot 'em up a little more interesting to play and spices up a fairly worn out formula at this point in history. This game has been asked for many times in the arcade port series, and today I am finally ranking from worst to best the very best port of Capcom's 1986 classic shoot 'em up, that is Hyperdyne Sidearms. The ZX Spectrum conversion of Sidearms isn't really much to brag about, but it's neither extremely really bad either. It's simply a version of Sidearms that is completely stripped back and has left you with the very basics. Go released this port back in 1988, and although at this point the Spectrum 128K models was a thing, this version was just coded for Spectrum 48K. Several Spectrum games around this era would have both a 48K as well as 128K versions in order to give higher end Spectrum users some added features such as music or even some enhanced visuals. And so in my opinion, this was a fairly lazy version where the bare minimum was coded for this. I did find that there were many times where I would just be flying around waiting for enemies to shoot at, and it was a fairly boring game to play, especially when there wasn't much to shoot at times, and this wasn't much fun. This version can also suffer from frame drops too when we have a few enemies on screen at any one time, and this becomes too obvious when we have a three-way weapon. Everything slows down quite drastically, which is where that 128K upgrade kind of helped things potentially. I met the first boss and literally killed it with one round of fire, and that's it, it exploded. This was likely one of the easiest bosses I have ever fought in my life. When our mecha is destroyed, we don't get any fancy explosion. He just simply disappears and reappears from the left hand side. We have a few lives here and no continues. I mean, it isn't the worst game in the world for the Spectrum, but it certainly isn't the best in this list. For a change in this series, I'm not going to comment on this IBM PC port from 1988. I'm just going to let you enjoy what you see and see how bad this really is. I cannot really defend the Commodore 64 version of sidearms, it's particularly pitiful. Sure, we have a full screen here with colours as well as music and sound effects, but that is all it really has going for it. As a game itself, I can't even say that it's attempting to be like the arcade game, it's just missing so much. Bosses are non-existent, and that awesome part of the game where we continue on to the next stage by scrolling downwards or across diagonally, it's all gone here. Once we finish a level, the screen goes black and the next level starts a few minutes later. Going back to the lack of bosses with this game, we actually do get a boss, and it's a little circle which appears and a couple of little enemy sprites appear, which one shot at and they are destroyed. Now, I mentioned the game has music and sound effects, but don't get too excited. For a 1988 C64 release, this music is way below average and the sound effects are pretty bland too. And really, sure, we do have colour, but really considering how bad the sprites and scenery look, it's likely this game could have looked much better in monochrome. It looks bad in one of the C64's worst looking games. This version could be so different in places from what it's attempting to port across to the C64, that's almost like one of those bizarre NES ports which normally deviates from every other version. It's normally the case that the Spectrum, Amstrad and Commodore 64 games are the same game with slight differences, but in this case this is absolutely totally different from the other two 8-bit computer versions. It's simply not a great version and also really boring to play. I actually had a fairly good time playing this 1987 Go Amstrad CPC release. Yes, surely it's fairly basic, but as you can see from the previous Spectrum port, this one is light years ahead in terms of visuals and music. And yes, I do compare Spectrum and Amstrad versions of particular games, because in most cases, one of them has a port of the other platform or vice versa. Firstly then, we have the joy of both music as well as sound effects with this release, which isn't always a thing for arcade ports, especially on 8-bit computers. And here we have both happening at once, and that 8-bit chiptune is actually sounding fairly good too, as well as the sound effects. Where this game really shines ahead of the Spectrum release is of course everything else. From the coloured sprites and the scenery such as the molten lava, the bosses are also nicely detailed with colour, and when shooting it actually looks fairly faithful as it can get next to the arcades game. When upgraded weapons in particular, it all looks like we have truly got something new to shoot at this alien scum, rather than just generic looking bullets. Although it's not ideal with a slower pace of scrolling, it's still an upgrade from the Spectrum version for sure, and scrolls a little faster too. We even get enemy placements here, in particular places where the Spectrum didn't have any at all. It's a fairly nice game to control. I'd likely say for what appears to be a Mode 0 Amstrad CPC game, this is fairly well done in every area, and it also offers a fair challenge to it too. Regardless of how many sprites were on screen at any one given time, the CPC powered sidearms without needing to slow down or lag due to this. The frame rates are very consistent here, and unlike the poor Commodore 64 version, this version stays on track of what's attempting to copy across to a mere 8-bit computer. For those Amiga fans out there who have played this version, you will likely agree with me that this could have been a whole lot better than it actually was. We of course have the nice visuals, but just like the Commodore 64 version, they weren't really anything to brag about, and that goes for this release too. Although at least with this version, it does tend to stick with the arcade's formula of how the levels flow and how they look and join onto each other. The real issue with this Amiga game is the fairly slow pace of it. It kind of also also felt like the enemy sprites were a touch on the larger side, and having a very slow mech to control makes this even harder at times than it needs to be. Most versions, if not all versions in this video, had a much speedier mech to control. This version didn't. The scrolling also feels relatively slow here too compared to most other versions. The word is that this is likely actually an Atari ST port of the same game. Just like the visual side of things, any Amiga fan will tell you this doesn't look the greatest, and especially for an Amiga game released in 1989. The music is also similar. Of course it's there, but it's just not very good. This is a very strange video. I am normally criticised for having a bias against Amstrad ports and at times even the Atari ST, but here I am again praising one of those microcomputers greatly. Throughout this series of comparing arcade ports, I have normally not really enjoyed playing Atari ST games as much as say Commodore Amiga versions of the same game, as the ST is known to have significant frame drops at times. I really can't say that though for Sidearms, which Go released in 1989 for the ST. This is a great port and I had a blast playing it. It opens with the typical loading screen artwork and we can choose particular options from the get-go. In terms of controller settings, I chose to play with joystick, and again, just like the CPC version, I was blown away by having both music as well as sound effects in this version. Limitations of the 8-bit versions meant that things like fancy weapon power-ups weren't as nicely detailed as this 16-bit version. Choosing between weapons here was extremely simple to do, and by holding onto the fire button for a few seconds, this allowed me to blast out bullets in all directions, and it looked awesome too. The first boss here was fairly challenging, or challenging if you are new to the game and don't know the routine of the shots being shot against you. After defeating the first boss, we then fly downwards inside of the cavern and we have a plethora of aliens to shoot at, whereas the 8-bit versions didn't actually include this. I would say very roughly that sprite placements were very similar to the arcade's release here too. Something I really admired about this release was its steady frame rate, and this held its own even though many sprites were on screen at once and also shooting at me. This is a great version and likely the best game for the ST that I have played in this series so far. This is the very awesome TurboGrafx 16 version from Neck Avenue, which released back in 1989. Just as I thought the Atari ST version was one of the best, then this version came along, and damn, this is a great version. Obviously, you can see from the gameplay footage that this is a huge visual upgrade compared with everything else in this list so far. The sprites are extremely detailed, the sparkling stars in the background look awesome, and kind of looks like some parallax scrolling has been added to give a perspective that stars are moving at independent speeds from each other. One huge noticeable difference here is that canyon after the first boss. Well, in every other version, this scrolls at a relatively slow speed compared with this version. That initial canyon can feel like a lifetime just gliding downwards, but here it is much more speedier and a lot better for it. And of course, it goes without saying, a better representation of the arcade game itself. This version sounds incredible too. There is, however, just one downside with this release, and that is the irritation of having to press the start button whenever we want to switch between different weapons. This will literally pause the game, and it just doesn't seem to flow that well. Everything else, though, is pretty much flawless here. The pace of the game is great, and the speed of the mech is just about right. It definitely isn't feeling too sluggish when moving or mech around on screen, and hit collision detection by far is the best so far out of all versions in this video. Whenever we scroll onto new levels of the game, this version scrolls diagonally too, and not all versions did that. Even switching to shoot left and right works so well here too. One button to shoot right and a dedicated button which swings our mech around to shoot left. Yes, I absolutely recommend the TurboGrafx 16 version. This is awesome. And if you thought the regular port was awesome, then this PC Engine CD version that goes by the name of Sidearms Special is even better, and this is the best all-round version of Sidearms outside of the arcade game itself. In fact, I would likely say this 1989 release, also by Neck Avenue, is even better than the arcades game, and for several reasons. Firstly, we have two versions of Sidearms here. The regular game is literally how it reads. This is the arcade port itself, but we also have an easy and medium difficulty level selection here. Now, taking my advice, you'll definitely need the easy modes for this game now that we have the option included. The colours are much deeper and there is much more clarity with sprites here too. The music in sound effects goes about saying this is a CD game after all, and so CD allowed more storage for this type of thing, and yes, it sounds spectacular for it too. Secondly, we have another mode exclusive to this CD version known as Before Christ mode, which plays different from the regular version in that it's a little more like playing R-Type than Sidearms, and this version of the game is extremely difficult. We can change our laser here and burst it out once the gauges reach full capacity, and it will take everything out in one blast, providing those enemies are on the same trajectory path. After dying here, we go back to the restart point of the level, and it certainly has that for sake factor about it. Just like the Super Graphics 16 version, this CD version also has an awesome animation for when collecting alpha symbols in the game, in which a separate robot attaches to the suit. Not every version did this as nice as this version. And that's it for ranking every version of Sidearms today. Do you agree with this list? Or do you think some other version deserves top spot here? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you're new to this series, in my comment section I'm going to drop the playlist so you can catch up on every single arcade port that I've ever uploaded. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching. This one has been a long time coming in my arcade port series. Another one of those well-loved arcade games by Sega releasing in 1990. Alien Storm has always gone down as one of those timeless classics which can easily be paired up with some of the other Sega greats of the time. Golden Axe, Outrun, Altered Beast, Shinobi. All roughly from the same era, but have all equally remained as some of the best in memory. Sega's very own development team known as AM1 produced Alien Storm. In fact, the same Japanese development team was also responsible for games such as Golden Axe. If you didn't play Alien Storm in the arcade originally, then you likely would have had a home conversion of it. Likely the most popular was the version for the Sega Mega Drive, in which it releases a standalone game and then appeared on the Sega Mega Drive Mega Games 3 cartridge, which featured alongside Super Thunderblade as well as Super Monaco GP. Alien Storm is considered as a hybrid between beat 'em up as well as railgun shooter, which makes a video like this one today fairly complicated in ranking, considering that the original arcades game comprises of a few varied sections from side-scrolling beat 'em up to railgun shooter to those very fast-paced stages where we're speeding along. For a particular port to get each one of these styles of the game in perfect form could be tricky, and especially since the notorious US Gold released some of these versions with the notorious Tiratex developing them. This could be tough. US Gold released games that even struggled with one style of gameplay, let alone several. And yes, I'm talking specifically about the abomination of Final Fight and Street Fighter 2 that they chucked out. The game is based around defending planet Earth against alien invaders who quite naturally want world domination. Well, why not? We play the game as either one player or up to 3 players originally. We play as the Alien Busters, a special forces team tasked to take on the invasion. The characters originally are Karen, Garth and Scooter, although these names are different depending on where in the world you played Alien Storm originally. We battle our way against the aliens with a standard attack and a limited supply of special attacks which hits everything on screen in one go. We can roll around to avoid enemies attacking us, and we can also also running attack. A total of 6 main missions, each comprising of sub-levels, and we also get voice samples throughout the arcade game, and of course music and some tasty sounding sound effects too. Like I said, the original Alien Storm is going to be a tough game to compare due to so much happening originally in the arcade game. Today we are ranking from worst to best the very best version that you could have owned back in the day of the classic Sega game Alien Storm. I'll be honest with you, I have played a hell of a lot worse on Alan Sugar's 8-bit microcomputer, but this game definitely isn't much good at all. Sure, it doesn't look bad, it is decent enough looking for what it is with its lush looking high contrast colours, very typical of Amstrad's Mode Zero coded games, but this is where the game really stops, and I mean really stops. Stops so badly that it seems that certain sections of the game will not let you progress. Take for example the second part of the game where we are inside of the shop, in the rail shooter section. After zapping down loads of aliens, there are 2 remaining aliens who are creeping behind the shop aisles and spitting out slime. No matter how many times I shoot at these aliens just would not budge, and it just seemed endless. I'm not kidding you, I must have been shooting at them for around 5 minutes, in which case I loaded up the game once again and was put into the same situation a second time round. It doesn't matter how many times these 2 aliens would not die at all. So, thankfully, to get past this annoying part, I used a cracked version of the game which I could skip the level altogether. Talking about the rail shooter segment, this wasn't actually a scrolling section like it should have been, or from at least what I've seen of it. Instead, we have a single screen, and the alien holding the girl hostage like in the arcade game, well, that's not here either. Now, as for the bulk of the game, the scroll and beat 'em up style parts, these, like I said, look good. They look good for an 8-bit microcomputer, but it seriously is let down by how it handles. Hit collision detection does work okay, but there are far too many times when I'm zapping aliens for it not to do anything at all. And of course we could also get slowdowns. Now, like I said, there have been a hell of a lot worse on the CPC in terms of arcade ports, but that doesn't let Alien Storm off the hook lightly. It's extremely blocky to control characters, and yes, we have all 3 characters to play as from the arcade game, but they do feel a little wooden to move around on screen, and the fun element that the arcade game offers is simply not here, full stop. When a game makes one feel stressed out over something like movement, then you know that it's a really badly developed game. Moving on to the running parts of the game, I'll be honest, these were likely the most enjoyable parts on the Amstrad, and although they were choppy, they did play relatively well compared to the beat 'em up and railgun sections. In terms of music, there is an option for music to be on or off, which I presume is in-game music. However, in the options menu, I opted for music, but didn't actually get in-game music at all. But I did manage to get sound effects, but I must say they were fairly poor, or at least very basic. And forget about voice samples in this version, there is none whatsoever. All in all, a good looking version of Alien Storm from US Gold for the Amstrad CPC, which released in 1991. But gameplay wise, it's not really much fun at all to play, as well as being broken in parts, or so it seems. Essentially, US Gold's ZX Spectrum game, which released for the Spectrum 48K and 128K models, seems identical to the Amstrad's version in terms of how it plays, that is. I mean, no question about it, this isn't as nice looking as the Amstrad's version, but at least this version actually worked, and I made it past the shooting section with no issues at all without the need of using cheats. We have all the same options as the Amstrad's version. As soon as the game boots up, we can select how we want to play the game. Of course, I opted for the Kempston joystick option to control the game. Now, of course, like I said, no doubt about it, the Amstrad CPC's conversion is probably the nicest looking version out of all the 8-bit computer ports, but the ZX Spectrum's characters here are much more detailed, as well as the backdrops, but only of course these are displayed in monochrome, which we shouldn't discredit too much, as the Spectrum was an extremely limited computer due to less superior support of offering several colours within games. It's much like this with the case of Amstrad versus Spectrum's versions. It's either opt for the CPC game, which seems to be broken but offers some charming looking visuals, or choose the Spectrum's version over it, which is less visually pleasing but actually is playable, where we don't have to rely on cheats to progress further into the game. In terms of speed and frame rates, then like I said already, it's almost identical to the Amstrad version. The Commodore 64's version is by far a big upgrade from the previous two versions, but again, is it a great version of Alien Storm? Well, it plays much smoother, and at least here there is in-game music, and the sprites and backdrops of levels are very nicely designed. The in-game music is actually fairly comparable with the arcade game itself. Of course, the mighty SID chip could produce much better than the music for the US Gold release, but of course it is attempting to emulate the arcade music, which was fairly basic to begin with, so in that department, yeah, the C64 version isn't bad at all. We don't get any sound effects in game though, unless we disable music at the start of the game. Presentation wise, the character selection screen again is a visual upgrade where we can scroll through all 3 characters to select who we'll play as in the game. It gives the whole arcade vibe here and does it fairly well too. Now on with the gameplay itself then. Well, in between stages, loading times even from disc are fairly hefty, but with the aid of emulation, all is not so bad, but still fairly annoying nevertheless. It is a fairly smooth game to play, and zapping aliens wanting to take over planet Earth seems satisfactory, and that hit collision detection is fairly good here, and certainly better than we have seen so far. We don't get an introduction animation scene, which is what the arcade game actually opens up with, neither do we get voice synth either, but arguably not every C64 game had this, although some did. As for the various styles of gameplay, we will start off with the main body of it all, which is of course the scroll and beat 'em up sections. I mean, sure, like I said, scrolling wise and sprite movement is fine, everything flows nicely and zapping baddies is okay, and certainly is one of Teratex's best ports. One of the most standout features of all these sections is being hit by enemies. If an alien hits us, we fly across the screen in a real speedy manner. It just seems very bizarre. Jumping, again, just seems like it is far too speedy for its own good. However, having said that, when we roll to avoid aliens, this is actually fairly useful in this version. Just a case of holding down on the fire button whilst pressing joystick down to do this action. Although nothing significant, the C64 version even has shadows beneath enemies, and these look particularly good when flying skulls are around. It just makes these parts a little easier to shoot these enemies. As for the rail shooting parts, again, this is a cut above the CPC's and Spectrum's attempt in terms of visuals and scrolling. As we shoot down aliens, the screen very quickly scrolls to another part of the level, and it all looks very good. The downside is that these sections don't last long with this version, but are certainly one of the C64's best parts of the game. And finally, for those segments which we speed through, again, nothing highly groundbreaking, but it scrolls really nicely and gets the job done. Let's just remind ourselves that I am not saying the Commodore 64 port of Alien Storm is a great game by any means, just possibly a slightly better than average arcade port, which also arrived from US Gold in 1991. If you're enjoying the content today, please like and subscribe, and also remember to hit that notifications bell and select all so you don't miss upcoming content. This channel also has a wealth of emulation tutorials, including standalone and front-end guides. Just Jamie is your ultimate go-to channel for everything retro related. Anyways, for now, on with the video. Sure, this has the more arcade look about it, and sprites are nicely sized, like that of what it's actually trying to copy, but this Commodore Amiga version that released in 1991 and also developed by Tiratex isn't really wonderful, and most certainly not great for an Amiga game from 1991 either. I mean, the whole presentation is there for sure, but gameplay wise, it's kind of like the Commodore 64 game, but an upgraded 16-bit version. The opening of the game is nice enough where we see two halves of the Alien Storm logo crash onto each other, and the character selection screen is also good too, but it's missing too many opportunities. For example, you might expect a proper animated introduction giving the Amiga's capabilities for doing this type of thing, but we get nothing at all. You might even consider extras in this game such as screaming victims running past you on the streets who are running from the aliens. Again, nothing here. It's much like I said, an upgraded Commodore 64 version, and like I also said, a fairly bad Amiga game for 1991 standards anyways. Having superior hardware, Tiratex should have taken full advantage of adding more to the game to bring the arcade experience home, but I truly think this is a fairly lazy port in many respects. The 8-bit computer versions are a little more forgiven given their date and age at the point of Alien Storm's release, but really this is typical Tiratex style, a pure cash grabber too from US Gold. As for in-game music, well, there doesn't appear to be any. Neither did I see an option for music in the menu anyway. We do, however, get some very rudimentary sound effects, and of course the Amiga was much more capable than this. We do get to play the game as choosing one of all three characters from the arcade game, or we can even play this version in 2-player mode. So everything is in order in that department at least, but I cannot comment on any of these ports as to if 2-player modes actually hinder the game in any way. My wife-to-be is more of a Disney cozy game girl, rather than defeating alien scum 1991 style. The platform and beat-em-up stages aren't particularly exciting to play. The rail shooting 3D segments are satisfactory to an extent though, and the running parts are also okay. I guess I would say one of the good features with the Amiga's version is using a special ability, although it is choppy when we see this take place, especially when using Garth's helicopter attack. It does kind of bring a touch of the arcade experience. And for the rail shooting segments, again, nothing really groundbreaking as such, but at least Tiratex bothered to make parts of the environment destructive here. Although it could have looked better, at least there was something added to kind of make it seem like this version was a 16-bit game after all. As for the running stages, again, nothing really special and just as good as the Commodore 64's version, only with nicer visuals. I found it incredibly difficult in comparing the Atari ST's conversion next to the Commodore Amiga's port, and the reason being is that both versions of Alien Storm are ridiculously similar. Of course, sound quality with the Amiga version was superior than this Atari ST's version due to arguably the inferior sound chip that the ST had. Having said that, I have ranked the ST version above Amiga's as the game did seem a little smoother and nicer to play. I mean, it could have been one of those occasions where the Amiga game was ported from this version directly. Rumour has it that this was a common thing back in those days, a little like the whole Spectrum and Amstrad scenario too. Even on those faster paced parts of Alien Storm, the frame rate was pretty much on par with the Amiga's version here. I can't really say much more out of both of these versions, and of course it is a matter of preference after all, but as a hardcore Amiga fan, even I noticed that this version was much better to play. It's a seriously bad day when a Sega Master System could do a better job than a more than capable 16-bit computer, but here we go. This is a superb port, and the reason why this is simply because Tiratex wasn't behind it. A developer known as Sims developed this Master System game, who also developed a few other notable decent Sega 8-bit games, such as the Castlevania style game Master of Darkness. Now granted, this is slightly different in places, but make no doubt about it, this is Alien Alien Storm through and through, and it doesn't completely deviate from the arcade game too much. Firstly, you will notice that we don't have all 3 characters with this version, but we just have Garth and Scooter. It is also missing the 2-player mode too, which is actually a bummer if you want to play this game back in the day with a friend. Very possibly the most difficult of all versions with this game too. I found myself dying a hell of a lot in this game. Although it is slow paced, it makes up for it through its difficulty level alone. The challenging parts are that enemy AI is programmed differently here from most other versions. We do have limited special attacks, but I will be honest, nothing spectacular and nothing more than a couple of flashes, which then sees our alien friends annihilated. We get no cutscenes or in-game animations for the storylines, but come on, this is being powered by an 8-bit console, so sacrifices were to be made. In addition to levels being a little different to other versions in this video, we also have a unique alien monster in this version too, such as the monster known as Muck. Yes, the sprites are majorly scaled down, but it's all very recognisable regardless. Music wise, it's not actually bad. A typical Master System style tune with some surprisingly very good sound effects implemented. Like I say, it's truly a really sad day when a mere Sega Master System can easily make Amiga and Atari ST look so bad. But of course there are drawbacks. Sure, it's not spot on to replicate the arcade game, and we do have a lack of a second player mode, but I rate this at this spot because, let's be honest, everything else by Tiratex in this list were fairly bad games. They weren't wonderful, and that's not to say it's simply because they were computer ports either. Particular computer ports have in some cases been so well done that they have ranked in very high places in my previous arcade ports videos. You likely realise that the Sega Mega Drive version was going to win the various ports of Alien Storm, and it's not really surprising compared with all the various other shoddy attempts, or should I say specifically US Gold's shady Tiratex attempts. I mentioned that the Sega Master System version was different in places. Well, the 16-bit Sega port is also different from other versions, and it's also unique too. But that's not to say that we only have 2 playable characters here. We actually have all 3 characters still, plus we can actually play as a 2-player game if we wish. Now, in good old-fashioned Sega Mega Drive style, we have several options too, including difficulty level changes, as well as other options such as sound tests. And we also have a dual mode too of that sort of thing. In comparison to the toughness of the Sega Master System's version, this release by Sega themselves is a walk in the park. Sega were also kind enough to increase the number of stages in this version too. So instead of having 6 stages like the arcade game had, well, we actually have 2 extra stages here, which is an absolute bonus if you love Alien Storm. On top of all of this, the sprites and backdrops and even the special attacks are all arcade's top quality. Well, as far as the Mega Drive can go with that regard. The sound in the Mega Drive game is extremely good here. Very similar to the sound of the arcade game itself. Killing aliens using special attacks all sound gripping with that Mega Drive sound chip giving us the very best. There is no issues with hit collision detection, and moving around the screen to walk beside enemies is silky smooth with no lag whatsoever. The 3D shooting sections are the best of all versions, and that's easy. Again, it scrolls beautifully, and the destruction caused towards things also looks really good. The crosshair will move absolutely anywhere too, whereas most other versions felt very wooden moving this around to shoot down aliens. As for those parts where we are running, these are of course flawless. Oddly enough, in most other versions, these sections auto-fired. Yet here, we do need to press on a button to shoot. But regardless, just like the other 2 sections, then of course this is awesome too. As for the introduction to the game, well, like I said, things are a little different here, but to some extent, at least there is something, and although fairly basic, it brings us that vibe that we have a purpose to play Alien Storm on the Mega Drive. The game is also brought to life here with all those nice bits and pieces, such as a comic book speech bubble style signs. We get pop-up telling us to go indoors and take on more aliens. The colour palette used is also absolutely the best in all the versions of Alien Storm. Although slightly pale in tone though, it much more resembles that arcades game look. And that's it for ranking every port of Alien Storm. So do you actually agree with the order of ranking? Do you think I was a little bit too harsh with the Amstrad CPC? But as many fans are aware, I try not to be too biased, and let's be fair, I even criticised the Amiga's version in this, which is very out the ordinary for me to do. So like I say, drop a comment in the comment section. If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. Remember to click all when you subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay retro.